The day Eva Donnelly rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, the sky was the color of a bruise and the wind carried the smell of rain and something older, something that felt like reckoning. She was 26 years old, and she had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in 11 days. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to her father, before the territory took everything her father had ever owned, and her brown eyes carried a sharpness that made even the men lounging outside the Silver Bell Saloon straighten up and pretend they had somewhere else to be. She rode a gray mare named Consequence, which her father had always said was the most honest name a horse could have, and she rode her like a woman who had nothing left to fear, because she had already lost everything she had been afraid of losing. She had a leather satchel across her lap, and inside that satchel were documents that she had spent 3 years gathering. 3 years of letters unanswered, of courthouse doors shut in her face, of territorial magistrates who smiled at her with the patronizing patience of men, who believed that women with grievances were like summer storms loud for a little while, and then simply gone. 3 years of being told that the deed to the Donnelly land in Comanche County had been legally transferred, that her father's signature on the document was valid, that there was nothing to be done, that she ought to go home and make herself comfortable and forget. Eva Donnelly had not forgotten a single day of it. Her father, Patrick Donnelly, had worked that land for 19 years. He had broken it with his hands and his back, and the backs of the 2 hired men who had stayed on out of loyalty, when the cattle prices dropped in the late 1870s, and money became a word that meant something very different from what it had meant before. He had raised Eva on that land after her mother died of fever when Eva was 8. He had taught her to read the weather and to read a contract, and to read the face of a man who was lying to her. He had told her, more times than she could count, that land was the only honest thing in the territory because the land could not deceive you. The land was what it was. And then in 1879, while Eva was in Wichita caring for her ailing aunt, a man named Harlan Goss had appeared in Comanche County with a document and 2 witnesses, and a story about a debt that Patrick Donnelly had allegedly signed into a land transfer agreement 18 months prior. Patrick Donnelly, who had been sick himself by that point, who had been confused in the particular way that a strong man becomes confused when his body begins to fail him, had been told that he was signing a loan extension. He had not been told he was signing away his land. He had died 6 months later, and Eva had come home to find the Donnelly property in the hands of the Goss Land and Cattle Company, with a caretaker on the porch who told her politely but firmly that she was trespassing. She had been fighting ever since. The problem with fighting in 1882 in the Kansas Territory was that the machinery of official grievance moved like a wagon with 3 broken wheels and a mule that had decided to stop cooperating. Lawyers cost money she did not have in the quantities required. The territorial court in Wichita had reviewed the claim twice and ruled against her twice on the basis that the transfer document bore Patrick Donnelly's signature and had been witnessed and notarized according to the law. What Eva had spent 3 years proving gathering sworn affidavits from neighbors, tracking down one of the original witnesses who had since moved to Missouri, and was willing to say that the document he had signed had described a different transaction than the one that had been executed, was that the notarization had been handled by a man named Clement Voss, who was Harlan Goss's brother-in-law, and who had lost his legal authority to notarize documents in the state of Missouri 2 years before the document had been executed, but whose credentials had been presented to the Kansas court as valid. It was a small crack in a very large wall, but Eva had spent 3 years learning that small cracks, if you put enough pressure on them, became doors. She had written to a lawyer in Caldwell named Abe Whitmore, who had a reputation for taking land cases that other lawyers would not touch, and he had written back with 6 lines that said more than most men managed in 6 pages. He said he had looked at the summary she had sent him. He said the Clement Voss connection was the thread worth pulling. He said she should come to Caldwell and bring everything she had, and he would see what he could do. She had packed consequence and ridden 3 days. The town of Caldwell sat just above the Kansas Indian Territory line and had the particular energy of a place that had not yet decided what it wanted to be when it grew up. It was a cattle town in the way that Dodge City was a cattle town, which meant it was also a town where men made money quickly and lost their judgment at approximately the same rate, and where the line between lawful and unlawful was drawn in chalk on a wet street. There were good people in Caldwell. Eva knew there were good people everywhere, the same way she knew there were bad people everywhere. And the important thing was learning which was which before you needed to stake anything important on the answer. She found Whitmore's office on the 2nd Street back from the main road, above a dry goods store. The lawyer was older than she had expected, with white hair and spectacles, and the kind of deliberate slowness that she had learned to distinguish from laziness. It was the slowness of a man who did not move until he was certain, which was a very different thing. He took her documents and read through them for 45 minutes without speaking, and Eva sat in the wooden chair across from his desk and let him read, because she had learned that patience was the most expensive thing she owned. When he was finished, he set the papers down and looked at her over his spectacles. "Miss Donnelly," he said, "I believe you have a case." Those were the 5 words she had been waiting 3 years to hear. "However," he continued, and she braced herself, because there was always a however, "the individual you need to present this argument before is Judge Raymond Alcott, who holds circuit court in this region. Alcott is not a corrupt man, but he is a careful man, and he is going to require more than an affidavit from a witness in Missouri. He is going to want corroborating documentation, showing that Clement Voss's notarial commission had in fact lapsed at the time of the signing. I have written to the Missouri Secretary of State's office 3 times on other matters, and the response time is not something that would please you." "How long?" Eva asked. 4 to 6 weeks for the records to arrive if they arrive. Another 2 to 3 weeks after that to schedule a hearing. We are looking at the better part of 2 months at the minimum." 2 months. She had $17.40 in her purse, a horse, a saddle, and the clothes she was wearing, with 2 additional sets in her bag. She had no family left in the territory. She had no connections in Caldwell. She had the documents and the determination and $17.40. "Is there work in this town?" she asked. Whitmore studied her. "What kind of work?" "The kind that pays honestly," she said. "I can cook, keep books, mend, and I can manage a household or a business. I learn quickly." The lawyer was quiet for a moment. "There is a man named Silas Easton who owns the Clearwater ranch about 4 miles east of town. He lost his housekeeper last month. Her husband took a position in Dodge City and they relocated. He has had 3 women come out to interview for the position and sent them all back to town. I cannot tell you why, as he is not a man who explains himself readily. But if you need work and a place to stay while we wait for the records, it may be worth your time to ride out and speak with him." "What manner of man is he?" Eva asked, because she had learned to ask this before she rode anywhere alone. Whitmore considered the question with the care of an honest man. "Difficult," he said. "He is a fair man. He is not cruel, but he is not easy, and he does not make much effort to be liked. He lost his wife 4 years ago, and I do not think he has fully decided what to do with himself since." Eva nodded. She could work with difficult. Difficult was familiar. What she could not work with was dishonest or dangerous, and neither of those words had appeared in Whitmore's description. She thanked the lawyer, confirmed that they would meet again in 3 days to discuss next steps, and went back downstairs to where consequence was tied at the post. The rain that had been threatening all afternoon was beginning to fall, light and cold, the kind of rain that couldn't decide if it was rain or just the sky being miserable. She rode east toward Clearwater Ranch. The ranch appeared out of the rain, and the distance like something that had been there long enough to belong to the land, instead of the other way around. It was not a flashy operation. no painted fences or decorative plantings. But it was solid. The main house was built from timber and stone and sat low against the earth the way a building does when it has been constructed by someone who understood that the Kansas wind was not something you argued with. There were outbuildings, a long bunkhouse, a large barn with a hayloft, and a windmill that turned with the slow authority of something that intended to keep turning long after everyone watching it had moved on. A man was standing in the yard when she rode in, studying the sky with the particular attention of someone who made their living based on what the sky intended to do. He was tall, with the broad shoulders of a man who had been doing physical labor his entire adult life, and he was wearing a dark coat over a work shirt, with his hat pulled low against the rain. When she rode into the yard and he turned to look at her, she saw a face that was younger than she expected given what Whitmore had told her. He could not have been more than 30 or 31, with dark hair and dark eyes under the brim of his hat, and a jaw that suggested he did most of his communicating through it when his mouth was not cooperating. He watched her ride into the yard the way he had been watching the sky, with complete attention and no particular expression. She pulled up Consequence and looked down at him from the saddle. "Are you Silas Easton?" "I am," he said. "My name is Eva Donnelly. Abe Whitmore told me you might be looking for someone to keep house." He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. The rain fell between them. "He was right," Silas said finally. "Get down out of the rain. I'll have someone see to your horse." That was how it began. The Clearwater ranch house was larger inside than it looked from the outside, with a kitchen that took up the back third of the main floor, a parlor that showed no signs of ever having been used for parlor activities, and a dining room with a long table that seated 8. There was a small room off the kitchen that had been the housekeeper's room, with a narrow bed and a window that faced the barn. Silas showed her around in silence, pointing at things without ceremony, and she followed him and looked at everything with the practiced attention of a woman who had learned that the way a space was kept told you most of what you needed to know about the people who kept it. The house was clean, but barely. It had the cleanliness of a space that had been managed with maintenance in mind, but nothing warmer than that. The kitchen was functional, but there was nothing hanging on the walls, no curtains on the windows, no softness anywhere that suggested someone had ever thought about comfort alongside utility. When the tour was done, Silas Easton stood in the middle of his own kitchen and looked at her with those dark, careful eyes and said, "I have 2 ranch hands in the bunkhouse, Tom Hale and Eddie Marsh. There are 6 horses, 40 head of cattle and the spring calves. I want hot food at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. The house can be managed as you see fit during the day. I pay $11 a month with room and board." Eva looked around the kitchen. "12, she said. He blinked. It was the first time his expression had changed since she'd arrived. "I beg your pardon," he said. $12 a month, she said evenly. "Whitmore told me you have sent 3 women home already. That suggests you are particular about what you want, which means this is not a simple position, which means it is worth $12. He was quiet for a moment. She did not fill the silence because she had learned that the person who fills the silence first is usually the person who needs the other one more, and she could not afford to be that person. 12, he said. Meals at 6, both morning and evening. Sunday is half a day. Agreed, she said, and extended her hand. He looked at her hand for just a moment, the way men sometimes did when a woman offered to shake instead of curtsy, and then he took it and shook it. His hand was calloused and warm, and the handshake was firm without being theatrical about it. "There's a coat rack by the back door," he said, and walked out. Eva stood in the kitchen of Clearwater Ranch and let out a breath she had been holding since she rode out of Wichita 11 days ago. She was not safe yet, and she was not close to what she had come to collect, but she had a room and a wage and a lawyer working on her case, and those were 3 things she had not had this morning. She hung up her coat and got to work. The first morning, she was up at 4:30, which gave her enough time to survey the kitchen properly, before she needed to have anything on the table. She found the pantry reasonably well stocked. Someone had been buying supplies, if not cooking them with any particular enthusiasm, and she made a full breakfast of eggs and salt pork and cornbread and coffee that was strong enough to make a person sit up straight and remember what they were about. When Silas came into the kitchen at 6 o'clock, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the table with an expression that she was beginning to understand was his version of surprise, which was to say it was nearly invisible but present if you knew to look for it. The two ranch hands, Tom Hale and Eddie Marsh, were considerably less reserved about it. Tom was a wiry man in his mid-30s with a red beard and an easy laugh, and Eddie was younger, 20 or so, with the particular shyness of someone who had grown up being told he should take up less space. They both sat down and ate with the focused appreciation of men who had been eating food that was merely adequate and had suddenly encountered food that was genuinely good. "Miss Donnelly," Tom said, reaching for a second piece of cornbread, "with respect, where have you been all my life?" "Minding my own business," she said pleasantly, and Eddie laughed into his coffee and Tom grinned, and Silas Easton ate his breakfast without looking up from his plate, but she noticed that he had a second cup of coffee. The first week passed in the rhythm of work, which Eva had always found more comforting than other people seemed to. There was something about the structure of a day built around tasks that needed doing that quieted the part of her mind that otherwise ran through every angle of her land case like a horse circling a corral. She cooked and cleaned and organized and repaired. She found 2 holes in the kitchen curtains, which she had brought down and washed and mended and rehung, and the parlor curtains as well, and she scrubbed the front porch floor that had not been properly cleaned in what appeared to be at least 2 seasons. Silas Easton was present at meals and absent at every other time, which suited her fine. He said almost nothing directly to her except what was operationally necessary. He was not cold exactly. It was more that he moved through his own house with a careful distance from everything in it, like a man who had learned that attachment was expensive and had decided to hold himself just outside the cost of it. She knew what that looked like. She had worn it herself for the 3 years since her father died. The evening of the 8th day, she was sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the documents spread out before her, reviewing the timeline of the Voss notarization for the 100th time, when she heard boots on the kitchen floor behind her and looked up to find Silas standing in the doorway of the kitchen in the particular way that meant he had not expected her to be there. He glanced at the papers. "What are you working on?" he asked. She had not told him anything about her reason for being in Caldwell. It had not come up, and she had not offered it because she had learned to be careful about who she told and when. Lawyers and judges were one thing, employers were another. "Legal documents," she said. "I have some business with a lawyer in town." He nodded once, as if that was a complete and satisfying answer, and went to the stove to pour himself a cup of whatever was left in the coffee pot from dinner. She watched him from the corner of her eye, and she realized she had been doing that fairly consistently for 8 days, watching him, and that it had started as the practical observation of a person learning their environment, and had at some point become something slightly different, something she was not prepared to examine yet. He was a quiet man in the way that some places are quiet, not empty, but deep. When he was out working cattle with Tom and Eddie, she sometimes saw him from the kitchen window, and there was nothing wasted in the way he moved. He worked with the self-contained competence of someone who had been working this specific land for long enough that the two of them, man and land, had come to an understanding. He took his coffee and was almost out of the kitchen when he paused. "There is a loose floorboard in the 3rd step of the back stairs," he said, without turning around. "I keep meaning to fix it. I will get to it this week." "I know about it," she said. "I fixed it this afternoon. There was a box of nails in the barn." He turned and looked at her, and this time there was something in his expression that was more than the usual careful blankness. It was not quite a smile. It was something that happened around the eyes, a quality of attention that felt different from what she had been receiving up until that point. "I see," he said. The front hinge on the pantry door was also giving trouble, she added. I oiled it. The oil was with the nails. Thank you, he said, with a gravity that suggested he meant both syllables of it. He went out, and Eva looked back down at her documents, but she found it slightly harder to concentrate than it had been before, and she attributed that to being tired and not to anything else. She rode into town on her half-day Sunday to meet with Whitmore. The lawyer had good news wrapped in moderately frustrating news, which she was beginning to think was the only kind of news that existed in territorial litigation. The Missouri Secretary of State's office had responded and confirmed they were pulling the records related to Clement Voss's notarial commission. The records would be arriving within 3 weeks rather than 6, which was the good news. The moderately frustrating news was that Harlan Goss, who Eva had not seen since she had stood on the porch of her father's house and been told she was trespassing, had apparently become aware that she was in Caldwell and had engaged his own lawyer, a man named Telforth who had an office in Wichita and a reputation for being very effective at making territorial land disputes complicated enough that other parties gave up. He knows I am here, Eva said. He has people who watch what other people are doing, Whitmore said, with a delicacy that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. Caldwell is not a large town, Miss Donnelly. You inquired about work, you came to see me. These things reach certain ears. Eva was quiet, turning this over. Is he likely to do anything beyond legal maneuvering? Whitmore took his spectacles off and cleaned them, which she had come to understand was what he did when he was thinking something he was not certain how to say. Harlan Goss is a businessman, he said. He operates through the law whenever the law will serve him because it has served him very well. I do not believe he is the kind of man who acts outside the law when he feels he has options within it. However, he is also a man who does not like being inconvenienced, and you, Miss Donnelly, represent a significant inconvenience. She rode back to Clearwater Ranch in the late afternoon, with the sun making long shadows across the grass and the wind pulling at her hat brim, and she thought about Harlan Goss knowing she was in Caldwell, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that she associated with everything that had happened since her father died, and then she made herself breathe through it and let it loosen, because panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford. When she rode into the yard, Silas was sitting on the porch steps with a piece of leather tack that he was working oil into, and he looked up when she came in. There was nothing particular in his expression, but she had been at Clearwater Ranch for 10 days now, and she was getting better at reading what was not said in his face, and what she read in it at that moment was something that might have been relieved. I thought you might stay in town for supper, he said. I said I would be back, she said. He looked at her for a moment. You did, he agreed. She put consequence in the barn and came back to the house to start supper, and as she passed him on the porch he said, without looking up from the tack, there is a loose post on the south fence that needs checking tomorrow if one of you has time. She was already through the door when she realized he had said one of you, as if she were part of the operations of the ranch and not simply someone who cooked meals in the kitchen. She was not sure why that particular thing stayed with her while she made supper, but it did. It was on the 14th day that something shifted. She was in the kitchen making bread dough in the early afternoon when she heard raised voices outside. Not angry, just loud. The particular volume of men who are not used to being heard over wind and cattle. She looked out the kitchen window and saw Tom and Eddie in the yard with a third man she didn't recognize, a heavy-set man on a bay horse who was gesturing broadly at the bunkhouse. After a moment she recognized the body language as sales. The man was selling something or trying to. She went back to her bread. When Silas came in for the midday meal a short time later, he was quieter than usual, which was saying something. She set a bowl of bean soup and a plate of cornbread on the table and poured his coffee and went back to the bread, and after a moment he said, without preamble, "The man in the yard this morning was a cattle buyer. He wants to offer on my spring calves." "Is that a problem?" she asked. The price he named was fair, Silas said. The problem is that accepting it would mean settling this season's debt with the bank, which is manageable, but it would leave nothing over for the repairs on the bunkhouse before winter. She was not sure why he was telling her this. She needed the bread dough and thought about it. How much is the bunkhouse repair? $40 for lumber if I get it from the mill in Caldwell. I can do the labor myself. She turned this over. Is there anyone else who might want the calves? He looked up from his soup. There was a buyer out of Abilene who came through in March, she said. I heard Tom mention it. If the prices have been rising, and they have been, I read the Caldwell Post when I go to town, you might have room to negotiate for better than fair. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention, the one she was getting familiar with. You read the cattle prices. I read everything, she said simply. My father taught me that. He said there was no such thing as information that didn't matter eventually. Silas was quiet for a long moment, and then he said very carefully, Your father sounds like he was a smart man. Something opened in her chest that she had not expected, a small clean ache. He was, she said. He was a very smart man and a good one. There was a silence that was different from their usual silences, warmer and more complicated. I am sorry, Silas said, for his loss, however long ago it was. She looked at him directly for the first time in what felt like a while. 3 years, she said, and it was not just his loss. It was his land and his life's work too, which is what I am here trying to get back. She had not intended to say that. It came out of her before she had made a decision about it, and she stood there with her hands in the bread dough and held his gaze and waited. His expression did not change into anything as legible as sympathy, but it did not close either. He said, Is that the legal business with Whitmore? Yes, she said. He nodded once deliberately. Is there anything you need? He asked. The question was so simple and so direct and so unlike anything anyone in a position of authority had said to her in 3 years that she felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she would not allow herself to follow. Whitmore has it in hand, she said. I just need time. Then you have time, Silas said, as if the decision were his to make and also entirely obvious, and he went back to his soup. She turned back to the bread dough and pressed her knuckles into it and breathed. 2 days later, she was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when Tom Hale came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw her, and there was something in his expression that made her still. What is it? She asked. Don't mean to trouble you, Miss Donnelly, Tom said, but there was a man in town this morning when Eddie and I went for supplies. He was asking about you, about where you were staying. A cold thread moved through her. What did he look like? Tom described a man who matched what little she knew about the agents Harlan Goss employed, not Goss himself, who wouldn't come to a town like Caldwell in person for something like this, but the kind of man he sent to make inquiries. Did Eddie tell him anything? She asked. Eddie didn't know what the man wanted, so he didn't think. Said you were out at Clearwater, Tom said, and looked genuinely sorry about it. I don't think Eddie understood that it might matter. It is all right, she said, because it was not Eddie's fault and she would not have him feel guilty about it. Thank you for telling me. She finished the laundry and went inside and sat at the kitchen table for 10 minutes, thinking. Then she went to find Silas. He was in the barn, checking the hooves on one of the working horses. She stood in the barn doorway and told him what Tom had told her, and she told him about Harlan Goss and the land and the document and the notarization. All of it, in the same even voice she used for everything, because she had learned that when she let emotion into her voice in front of men, they stopped hearing the facts and started managing her feelings, and she could not afford that. When she was finished, Silas set the horse's hoof down and straightened up and looked at her with that deep, careful attention. This Goss, he said, you think he would send someone to intimidate you? I think he wants me to go away, she said. The most effective way to make me go away is to make staying seem like it costs more than I can afford. The legal case is very close to being strong enough. If I disappear before we can present it, he keeps the land with no further difficulty. Silas was quiet. He turned and stroked the horse's neck in an absent way that suggested he was thinking. You will not leave, he said. It was not a question, and it was not a command either. It was an observation, delivered with something that sounded very close to respect. "No," she said, "I will not leave." He looked at her steadily. "Then you are safe here," he said. "Clearwater is my land, and what happens on my land is my business, and I do not appreciate men coming around my property to intimidate people under my roof. If anyone comes out here making trouble for you, they will have to go through me first." The directness of it hit her somewhere she had not been expecting. She had been managing her own safety for 3 years, making every calculation herself, never having anyone offer to stand between her and the thing that was trying to wear her down. She was not sure she had realized until this moment how much that had cost her. "Silas," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. "I do not want to bring trouble to your door." "You didn't bring it," he said. "It followed you. That's a different thing entirely." He looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, "My wife used to say that this ranch needed to be worth something more than what it grew. I think she meant it ought to be a place where right things happened." He paused. "I don't think I've been doing a very good job of that." It was the most he had said about his late wife in 2 weeks of daily proximity, and the saying of it seemed to cost him something. Eva looked at him and saw it the way grief sat on a person who had learned to carry it quietly, the specific set of the jaw when a loss was old enough to have become structural, part of the architecture of who you were. She understood that architecture. "She was right about the ranch," Eva said gently. "It is a very good ranch." Silas looked at her for a long moment, and then he said quietly, "I am glad you came here, Miss Donnelly." "Eva," she said. "You can call me Eva." Something passed across his face that was not quite a smile, but was very close to the feeling that precedes one. "Eva," he said, and turned back to the horse. She walked back to the house in the late afternoon light with her heart doing something complicated and unasked for in her chest. The weeks that followed were a layering of small things that accumulated the way seasons do, not all at once, but steadily. One day built on the last until she looked back and realized that the distance between where she had started and where she was now was considerable. Silas began stopping by the kitchen in the evenings, not often enough to be a pattern, but often enough to have become something she was aware of. He would pour coffee from whatever was left, and sometimes he would sit at the table, and sometimes he would stand by the window, and they would talk about the ranch or about the news from Caldwell or about whatever subject presented itself. He was never easy in the way that Tom was easy. There was always that quality of careful deliberateness in him, as if he chose each word before he used it, but she had stopped finding it uncomfortable. She had started finding it honest. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. And after 3 years of fighting through layers of institutional language that had been specifically constructed to obscure meaning, his directness felt like clean water after a long drought. She told him, one evening, about riding back to her father's property after his death and finding the caretaker on the porch. She had never told anyone the complete version of that moment, the exact quality of the light that afternoon, the smell of the prairie grass, the way she had known before the man opened his mouth that something had happened that could not be easily undone. She told it plainly, the way she told most things, but Silas listened with the full weight of his attention, and when she was finished, there was a silence that felt like something being acknowledged. "I am sorry that happened to you," he said, and it was not the polite variety of sorry. It was the kind that understood the specific dimensions of the loss. She told him, another evening, about the magistrates who had dismissed her, and the lawyers who had told her she was unlikely to prevail, and the years of letters and documentation, and the slow, grinding work of building a legal argument when you had no money and no influence, and only the facts on your side. "Most people would have stopped," he said. "I know," she said. "I was not able to." "Why?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Because it was wrong," she said. Because my father worked that land for 19 years and loved it, and it was stolen from him by someone who knew he was sick and confused and could be taken advantage of, and the law was used as the instrument of that theft, and I believe the law ought to be better than that. I believe if you care enough about making it better, you have to use it to prove itself." He looked at her across the kitchen table, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen before, something warmer than the usual careful attention, something that made her heart press against the inside of her ribs with more intent than was professionally appropriate. "You are remarkable," he said quietly, and then looked away as if he had surprised himself. She looked at her coffee cup for a moment. The kitchen was warm with the stove and the lamplight, and outside the prairie was dark and wide and full of Kansas wind. "I do not feel remarkable most of the time," she said. "I feel stubborn." He laughed. It was a short, quiet sound, the laugh of a man who does not do it frequently, and it was entirely genuine, and she felt it somewhere in the region of her sternum. The letter from the Missouri Secretary of State arrived at Whitmore's office on a Tuesday in late April, and Whitmore sent word out to the ranch with a passing rider, and Eva rode into town the next morning with her heart beating against her ribs in a different way than it had been doing lately. The documents confirmed it. Clement Voss's notarial commission had lapsed 14 months before the date on the Donnelly land transfer document. The commission renewal he had submitted to the Missouri authorities had been rejected on the grounds of an unpaid bond. For 14 months, every document that Clement Voss had notarized was technically invalid, and the Donnelly land transfer document fell squarely inside that period. Whitmore set the documents down on his desk and looked at her over his spectacles with the measured excitement of a man who worked in a field where genuine victories were infrequent and therefore notable. "We have it," he said. Eva sat in the wooden chair across from his desk and put her hands flat on her knees and breathed. "We have it," she said. "I will file for a hearing before Judge Alcott as soon as I can get his schedule. Telforth will respond with objections. There will be a counter-argument, probably questioning whether the invalidity of the notarization constitutes sufficient grounds to void the transfer, but I believe the case law on this is clear. A notarization performed by someone without legal authority to notarize is functionally the same as no notarization at all, and without valid notarization, the document does not meet the statutory requirements for land transfer in this territory." "How long for the hearing?" Eva asked. 2 weeks at the earliest, possibly 3. 2 to 3 more weeks. She had enough of a wage saved to cover her expenses through the end of the month. She was fine. She was more than fine. She rode back to Clearwater Ranch feeling something she had not allowed herself in 3 years, something that was distantly related to hope, and close enough to joy that she could feel its warmth without quite daring to look directly at it. She was 3 miles from the ranch when she became aware that there was another rider on the road behind her, close enough to be intentional. She glanced back and saw a man she didn't recognize, well-dressed for the territory, on a good horse. Something about the deliberateness of his pace made the back of her neck prickle. She kept her pace steady and her face forward and let her hand drift to the small derringer that she kept in the inside pocket of her coat, which had been her father's and which she carried the way other women carried a crucifix, as a reminder and a last resort both. The rider came up alongside her. "Miss Donnelly," he said. She looked at him evenly. "I don't believe I know you." "My name is Reeves. I work for Mr. Goss." He said it pleasantly, as if delivering good news. "Mr. Goss asked me to pass along a message." "I am listening," she said, still moving, not stopping. "Mr. Goss is a reasonable man," Reeves said. "He understands that you have an emotional attachment to the property, and he respects that. He would like to offer you a settlement, $300 for a signed statement that you withdraw all claims and cease any further legal action." $300. It was more money than she had seen in 2 years. It would have kept her comfortable for the better part of 18 months. It was a significant amount of money being offered by a man who had stolen her family's land and then spent 3 years watching her try to take it back, and the offering of it told her two things. He was frightened of what she had found, and he thought she could be bought. "No," she said. Reeves's pleasant expression did not change. "Miss Donnelly, it would be worth your time to consider it carefully. Mr. Goss is a patient man, but legal proceedings in this territory can become complicated and expensive, and Mr. Telforth is a very thorough attorney." "I have a thorough attorney too," she said, "and I have the Missouri Secretary of State's records showing that the notarization on that document was not legal. I will not be taking Mr. Goss's $300. I will be taking my father's land back through the territorial court, with interest in the form of justice, if that happens to be available." There was a moment where Reeves's pleasantness became something else, still not threatening but cooler. "I see," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other. Good afternoon, Mr. Reeves." She put consequence into a canter and left him on the road, and she did not look back, because she had decided a long time ago that looking back was for the people who had not yet made up their minds. When she rode into the Clearwater yard and dismounted and walked consequence to the barn, Silas was coming in from the south field, and he took one look at her and said, "What happened?" She told him, because she was done keeping things measured and private, at least with him. His jaw tightened in the way she had come to read as controlled anger. "Goss sent a man to offer you money to go away." "Yes," she said, "and you told him no." "Clearly," she said. "Are you all right?" The question, simple, direct, concerned, landed on her like a hand on the shoulder, steady and warm. She looked at him, and for a moment she felt everything at once, the 3 years of fighting and the loneliness of it, and the extraordinary unexpected warmth of standing in this particular barn on this particular ranch with this particular man looking at her with that particular expression. "I am very all right," she said. "We have the Missouri records. Whitmore is filing for a hearing. 2 to 3 weeks and I will be standing in front of Judge Alcott." Something moved in Silas's expression, relief, she thought, genuine and uncalculated. "Then it is almost over." "Almost," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "When it is over, you'll go back to Comanche County." It was a statement, not a question, but there was something in it that asked, and she heard what it asked. "I don't know yet where I'll go," she said carefully. "The land is in Comanche County. But I have not decided that Comanche County is the only place I could be." He looked at her steadily. The barn was warm and dim and smelled of horses and hay and the particular clean earthiness of a well-kept working space. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the grass with its perpetual conversation with the sky. "Eva," he said, and there was a weight in her name in his voice that had not been there in previous usings of it. "I have been trying to find the right way to say something to you for the past several weeks, and I have not found it yet, so I am going to attempt it without having found it and ask for your patience." She waited, holding her breath without meaning to. "When you came here," he said, "I was not in a good place. I don't mean that as an excuse for anything. I was doing my work and running this ranch and managing well enough by the measures I was using. But I had been running this place at a distance from everything that ought to matter about it, including myself, for 4 years. And then you came here and fixed the back step, and oiled the pantry hinge and made cornbread that made Eddie Marsh almost cry at the breakfast table. And you talked about your father and your case, and the law like someone who believed that things could be put right even after they had been made very wrong. And he paused. The way he paused was the way a man pauses when he is being more honest than he has been with himself, and has to let that honesty catch up with him. "I have found, over these past weeks, that this ranch feels more like what it is supposed to be, and I believe that has a great deal to do with you specifically." Eva looked at him, this difficult, fair, honest man who had said come out of the rain and get down from your horse, and then had proceeded to be, without any apparent effort, the most genuinely decent person she had encountered in 3 long years. "Silas," she said, "are you saying you want me to stay, even if my legal case resolves?" "I am saying," he said, carefully but with total clarity, "that I do not want you to go. I am saying that I would very much like for you to consider staying, and that if you stayed, I would spend whatever time you gave me making it worth your while to have done so." He paused again. "I am also aware that you came to this ranch as my employee, and that I have a responsibility in that regard, and that you have had enough of people using positions of power to take things from you, and I want you to know that I am not asking you as your employer. I am asking you as a man who has, somewhat unexpectedly, fallen considerably in regard for you, in the way that I believe is called." "I know what it is called," she said, and she was smiling, and she had not quite expected to be smiling, but there it was, warm and undeniable. He looked at her smile with that expression she had first seen when she had told him about the floorboard and the pantry hinge, that thing that happened around his eyes. "I am 29 years old," he said, "and I have not felt this way since Margaret, and I will be honest with you, and say that the feeling frightened me a little at first because I did not know if I was permitted to feel it again. But I have decided that she would have thought I was being an idiot about it, which I believe is accurate." Eva stepped forward and put her hand on his arm through his coat sleeve and felt the warmth of him and the solid reality of him and the profound simple relief of being in a place where she did not have to be afraid. "It frightened me a little too," she said, "for different reasons." "Are you frightened now?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "No," she said, "not right now." He looked at her hand on his arm and then at her face, and then he placed his hand over hers, very carefully, the way he did everything deliberately, with full weight given to the decision. "Good," he said. They stood like that in the barn for a long moment, with the horses breathing nearby and the prairie wind moving outside, and Eva felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in so long that she had half forgotten it was available to her. She felt held. The night before the hearing, Eva could not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen and looked at the ceiling and went through every argument, every document, every counter-argument that Telforth might make, and every response Whitmore had prepared, until the arguments blurred together and became just words, and she was left with the bare fact of it. Tomorrow, she would stand in the territorial courtroom in Caldwell and make the case that her father had been wronged and that the land should come back. She got up at 3 in the morning and went to the kitchen and started heating water for coffee, and she was standing at the stove in the dark when she heard boots on the stairs and Silas appeared in the doorway in his shirt and trousers, his hair still rumpled from sleep. "I heard you get up," he said. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said. "You didn't," he said. "I wasn't sleeping either." He came into the kitchen and sat at the table, and she poured 2 cups when the water was ready and sat across from him in the lamplight. And they were quiet together in the way that people are quiet when there is nothing left that needs to be said, and the being together is the thing. After a while he said, "You are going to win tomorrow." "I don't know that," she said. "I know that," he said, with a certainty that was not the performative reassurance of someone trying to make her feel better. It was the conviction of someone who had looked at the facts and reached a conclusion. "You have been building this for 3 years. You found every document, you tracked down every person, you found the one crack in the foundation that holds the whole structure up. You have done everything right. Now you let Whitmore make the argument, and you let Alcott look at the evidence, and you trust that the law can occasionally be what it is supposed to be." She looked at him across the coffee cups in the lamplight. "You sound like you believe in the law." "I believe in the people who refuse to stop using it until it does what it is supposed to do," he said. "That is not the same as believing in the law. That is believing in you." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand over and held hers in a warm, steady grip. They sat like that in the kitchen of Clearwater Ranch while the night moved toward dawn, and outside the Kansas prairie was dark and wide and indifferent. And inside the lamp burned and the coffee cooled, and Eva Donnelly held the hand of a man who believed she was going to win, and somewhere in that holding she found the steadiness she needed to face the morning. The hearing took place in the territorial courthouse in Caldwell. in a room that smelled of wood polish and old paper, and the accumulated weight of official proceedings. Judge Raymond Alcott was exactly as Whitmore had described him, a careful man, not young, with a reputation that ran ahead of him for rigorous impartiality and a tolerance for nonsense that measured approximately zero. Telforth, Goss's attorney, was everything his reputation suggested: quick, precise, and very good at making valid arguments seem procedurally inconvenient. He arrived with a thick folder of documents and the particular confidence of a lawyer who had won a great many cases by making the opposing party feel like they were wasting the court's time. Eva sat beside Whitmore at the plaintiff's table and kept her hands folded and her face composed and listened to everything and said nothing, because it was Whitmore's job to speak today and she trusted him. The core of the argument unfolded over the course of the morning. Whitmore laid out the timeline methodically. The land transfer document dated November 1879, the notarization by Clement Voss, the Missouri Secretary of State's records showing Voss's commission had expired in September 1878, and the renewal had been formally rejected in October of that year. He produced the documents. He read the relevant sections into the record. He produced the affidavit from the Missouri witness, who had testified that the document he had signed had described a different transaction. Telforth's counterargument was sophisticated. He argued that the invalidity of the notarization was a technicality that did not negate the underlying intent of the transaction, and that intent was demonstrable through other means. That Patrick Donnelly had signed the document, that witnesses had been present, that the transfer had been executed in good faith by all parties. Whitmore's response to this was the thing Eva had been waiting for, the thing they had prepared together at the kitchen table over 4 nights of quiet work while the ranch slept around them. He argued that good faith could not apply to a transaction where one party was operating under a medically documented condition of cognitive impairment. And here, he produced a statement from the doctor in Comanche County, who had treated Patrick Donnelly in the months before his death, describing in clinical terms the nature of his illness and its effect on his ability to understand complex legal documents, and where the notarizing party was not legally empowered to notarize, and where the document had been materially misdescribed to the signing party. He argued that the convergence of these 3 factors made the transfer document not merely technically invalid but substantively void, and that equity as well as law required its vacating. Judge Alcott asked a number of sharp questions of both attorneys. He asked Telforth whether the defense could produce any evidence that Patrick Donnelly had been informed of the nature of the transaction he was signing, and Telforth could not produce such evidence because it did not exist. He asked Whitmore whether the Missouri records he had produced were certified originals from the Secretary of State's office, and Whitmore confirmed they were and produced the certification seal. The judge then asked to examine the original land transfer document and both sets of supporting documentation himself. He took 30 minutes. When he returned to the bench, he looked at both tables with the expression of a man who has reached a conclusion he is prepared to defend. "The court finds," he said, in the particular measured voice of official pronouncement, "that the land transfer document bearing the date of November 14th, 1879, and the purported signature of Patrick Donnelly was notarized by a party without legal authority to perform notarization in the territory of Kansas or the state of Missouri at the time of signing. The court further finds that the circumstances surrounding the signing, including the documented medical condition of the signer and the material misdescription of the document's purpose, support a finding that the transfer was invalid both technically and equitably. The transfer is hereby vacated. The deed to the property in Comanche County, held under the name of the Goss Land and Cattle Company, is null and void as of this date. The property reverts to the estate of Patrick Donnelly, and the court will issue an order for the transfer of valid title to Eva Claire Donnelly as the surviving heir." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Telforth set down his pen with a precise, controlled motion that was the attorney's equivalent of throwing something. Whitmore allowed himself one small, satisfied exhalation, and Eva Donnelly sat very still at the plaintiff's table and felt the weight that had been sitting on her chest for 3 years lift slowly, like morning fog off a river, until it was gone, and there was only the clean, open air where it had been. She shook Whitmore's hand and thanked him, and he said that it had been his genuine pleasure and that he would have the paperwork in order within a week. She walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun. Silas was waiting on the street outside, leaning against the hitching post with his hat in his hands. He had not asked to come. She had not asked him to come. He had simply saddled his horse that morning and ridden into town at the same time she had, without saying anything about it, and she had not said anything either, because she understood what it was. When she came out of the courthouse and he saw her face, he knew. He straightened up from the post and looked at her with everything unguarded in his expression, all the careful containment gone, and it was the first time she had seen him fully open like that, and it was beautiful. "You won," he said. "I won," she said. He crossed the street in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms, and she went into them without hesitation, and he held her with a fierceness that said more than anything he had said in any of their kitchen evenings or any of their careful conversations. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and allowed herself, finally, entirely, to feel the full weight of what she had won and what it had cost and what it meant. And she shook with it, not crying exactly but something close to it. The physical release of 3 years of held breath. He held on through all of it. When she straightened up and stepped back to look at him, his expression was soft in a way that she thought was probably rare and was certainly precious. "Your father would be very proud," he said. She put her hand on his chest over his heart and looked at him. "I know," she said. "I hope he knows." He covered her hand with his. "I believe he does," he said simply, and she believed him. They had supper in town that evening at the one sit-down establishment in Caldwell that could properly be called a restaurant, which was a somewhat optimistic designation for what was in practice a large room with 6 tables, and a cook named Bertie who made excellent roasted chicken and tolerated no nonsense. Tom and Eddie had come into town as well, because they had heard the outcome through the particular speed with which news moved in a small cattle town, and they sat at the next table, and Eddie kept beaming across at Eva, and Tom kept raising his coffee cup in toasts that became progressively more elaborate as the evening progressed. Silas sat across from Eva and watched her with eyes that did not pretend to be looking at anything else, and she let herself be looked at, which was something she had not done in a long time. After supper, walking back toward where the horses were tied, the town was settling into its evening version of itself, the saloon lit up and noisy in the middle distance, the stars enormous over the flat land, the spring air cool and fragrant with the particular smell of the Kansas prairie at night, which was unlike anywhere else in the world. Silas stopped walking and took her hand, and she stopped beside him. "Eva," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that you can say no without anything between us changing." She turned to face him. In the starlight, his face was serious and very earnest, and she thought that this was probably one of the bravest things she had ever seen a person do, not for its danger but for its vulnerability. "When your business here is concluded," he said, "and you have your deed and your land back, I want to ask you not to go back to Comanche County alone. Or rather, I want to ask if you would consider doing me the very great honor of becoming my wife." "I am not an easy man," he said, with a frankness that made her want to laugh and also to press her hand against his face. "And I know that, and I know you could do better in many respects. But I love this ranch, and I believe you love it too, a little, or at least you have forgiven it for not being your own land. And I love you, quite considerably. And I think this ranch wants for the things you bring to it, and I believe I do too." The prairie was enormous and dark around them, and the stars were out in numbers that made the sky look like something intentional. And Silas Easton was standing in front of her holding her hand and asking her if she would be his wife with the careful honesty of a man who had never in his life said a thing he did not mean. Eva thought of her father telling her that land was the only honest thing in the territory. She thought that he had been almost right, but not entirely. There were honest men too if you were patient enough to find them. Yes, she said, I will marry you, Silas. His exhale was so genuine and so relieved that she did laugh then, softly, and he looked at her laugh with that thing that happened around his eyes. And then he bent and kissed her for the first time, very deliberately, with both hands holding her face as if she were something rare and known to be so, and the spring night was vast and warm around them. Behind them, at some distance, Tom Hale said something to Eddie Marsh that made Eddie whoop, and Eva pulled back from Silas and looked at him with laughing eyes, and he shook his head with the exasperated fondness of a man who cannot quite believe the company he keeps. I am going to pay those two considerably less next month, he said. You will not, she said. No, he agreed. I will not. They were married in June of 1882 in the small church in Caldwell on a Saturday morning with Whitmore as a witness and Tom and Eddie in the front pew looking extremely proud of themselves for reasons that were entirely adjacent to the actual wedding. The ceremony was simple, and the reception was held at Clearwater Ranch, where Bertie from the restaurant had been prevailed upon to cook. And the weather was perfect in the way that Kansas weather occasionally is in June, warm and clear with a breeze off the prairie that smelled of grass and something sweetly wild. Eva wore a dress that she had made herself from blue cotton that she had chosen specifically, because her father had once told her that her mother had worn blue on their wedding day, and that it had been the second most beautiful thing he had ever seen, the first being Eva herself as a baby, which was the kind of thing fathers said but which Eva had always suspected he meant. Silas stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him with an expression that was entirely open, no containment, no careful distance, just all of it visible and real, and Eva walked toward him feeling that she was moving toward something she had been traveling to for longer than she had understood. In August, Eva rode down to Comanche County with Silas beside her, and a copy of the court order and the newly executed deed in her satchel. She had written ahead to the Goss Land and Cattle Company's caretaker to notify him of the court order and give him proper time to vacate, and he had done so with more grace than she had expected, leaving the buildings in reasonable condition. She rode onto her father's land, her land, on a Tuesday morning when the light was the particular gold of late summer, and the grass was long, and the barn needed some attention, and the house needed more, and she dismounted at the fence post where she had stood 3 years ago and been told she was trespassing, and she stood there and looked at it all for a long moment. Silas dismounted beside her and stood at her shoulder and was quiet, because he had gotten very good at knowing when quiet was the right thing. "Hello," Eva said softly, not to Silas, to the land. "I am back." The wind moved through the grass. She put the deed in her pocket and turned to her husband and found him watching her with those dark, steady eyes. And she leaned into his arm, and he put it around her, and they stood together at the fence post of the Donnelly land and looked at what the territory owed her and what it had, in the end, delivered. What happened in the months that followed was the particular kind of happiness that does not announce itself but accumulates. It was not effortless. Nothing that is real is effortless, but it was good, with the substance of good things that have been earned. They worked out an arrangement with the Donnelly land that Eva had thought through carefully, and that Silas had listened to with his full attention and approved without qualification. She would keep the property, maintaining it as a working piece of land in her name, which she would lease for grazing during the seasons when it was not needed for anything else. The income from the lease was modest but consistent, and it meant the land was being used and cared for and was not lying fallow. Someday, she had said, She wanted to build something on it that her father had imagined but never gotten to, a proper farm with crops as well as cattle. Silas had said that was a fine idea, and that he knew a good man in Comanche County who ran a grain operation and might be willing to partner on something like that. He said it just like that, practically and with full seriousness, and she had looked at him and thought for perhaps the 100th time since she had married him that she had found, in the most unexpected place and in the most improbable circumstances, the kind of partner that her father had said was worth waiting for. Someone who heard your dream and immediately started thinking about how to build it. The autumn of 1882 came in with color and cold, and an early snow that dusted the Clearwater Range in the first week of October, and Eva sat by the parlor fire on an October evening with a book in her lap and her feet tucked under her, and Silas in the armchair across the fire with his own book, and she looked up at him, and thought that this was what the parlor had been waiting for all along, someone to use it properly. He looked up from his book and caught her looking at him and raised an eyebrow. "Nothing," she said, smiling. "You were thinking something," he said. "I was thinking that this room has good bones," she said. "I always thought so." He looked around the room at the curtains she had made from fabric she had chosen in town, the small rug she had found at the dry goods store, the way the lamplight fell on walls that had not changed but seemed somehow warmer than they had been. "You did that," he said. "We did it," she said, and went back to her book. By November she knew she was expecting, and she told Silas on a quiet Sunday morning, with the snow coming down outside the kitchen window and the coffee hot, and the world small and warm and very good. He set his coffee cup down and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before but recognized immediately. It was joy, the simple, complete kind, the kind that has no qualifications or reservations, just itself entire. "Eva," he said. "I know," she said. He came around the table and pulled her to standing and held her in the kitchen with the snow outside and the coffee getting cold, and she held on and felt everything. The land, the case, the 3 years, the riding into Caldwell in the rain on a gray horse named Consequence, the kitchen with the loose floorboard she had fixed, the evening conversations, the courtroom, the deed, the wedding, the October fire. All of it flowing through her in a river of the life she had made by refusing to give up on the one that had been taken. "Your father would be outrageously pleased," Silas said into her hair. "He would be insufferably pleased," she agreed, laughing, and felt his chest shake with his own quiet laugh against her. Their son was born in July of 1883, in the heat of a Kansas summer, delivered with the assistance of the midwife from Caldwell, who was a capable woman named Mrs. Ogle, with a manner that was brisk and entirely reassuring. He was a solid, healthy boy who came into the world with the determined expression of someone who has arrived and intends to stay. And he had Silas's dark eyes, and very quickly, a disposition that combined his father's careful deliberateness with his mother's absolute refusal to be deterred. They named him Patrick for Eva's father, and on the day that Mrs. Ogle handed him to Silas for the first time, and Silas stood in the bedroom of Clearwater Ranch with his son in his arms and looked down at him with the full weight of his attention, Eva watched from the bed and thought that she had never seen him more himself than this, completely present, completely committed, the careful distance entirely gone. He looked up at her and his eyes were bright. "Patrick Easton," he said, trying it. "Patrick Donnelly Easton," she said. He looked at her and then at the boy and then back at her. "Patrick Donnelly Easton," he said, with total gravity, and what she could see was complete gratitude. "That is a very good name." Tom and Eddie, when they were allowed in the next day, behaved in the precise manner she had predicted. Tom talked too loudly and made remarks about the baby's evident superior intelligence that were the compliments of a man who does not know how to talk to babies, but is trying his genuine best. And Eddie went very quiet and very still, the way he did when he was genuinely moved and did not have words for it. Tom bounced Patrick gently and said, "He's going to grow up to be the best rider in the county." He is going to grow up to read well and make careful decisions, Eva said. Those two, Tom said hastily, and Eddie caught Eva's eye and smiled his shy smile, and she smiled back. The years on Clearwater Ranch built themselves with the honest weight of real things. The bunkhouse was repaired before the second winter. The fence lines were extended in the third year to accommodate new cattle. Eva's arrangement with the Donnelly land produced steady income, and she hired a local family to care for it through the seasons. A young couple named the Berries who worked the land with the kind of love that matched what Patrick Donnelly had put into it, which Eva found deeply satisfying every time she rode down to check on it, which she did several times a year. She also, over the course of those years, became something she had not quite set out to become, but had perhaps been moving toward all along, a person that other people in difficulty came to. Word moved in a territory the way water moved, finding every low channel, and the word that moved about Eva Easton, née Donnelly, was that she had beaten the Goss Land and Cattle Company in territorial court on a case that 3 lawyers had told her was unwinnable, and that she had done it by knowing the law better than the people who made their living from it. Women came to her with deeds and letters and contracts and questions, and she read what they brought and told them plainly what she saw and pointed them toward Whitmore when there was something actionable. She and Whitmore developed a genuine working relationship over the years, the lawyer and the woman who had been his most determined client, and more than once he said to her that she would have made a fine attorney, and more than once she said that the territory was not quite there yet on that particular idea, and he said that it was getting there, and she said that she intended to help push it. Silas knew all of this and encouraged all of it without being asked. This was the thing she had come to understand was the deepest truth about him. He did not love her in spite of her determination and her fire and her refusal to be diminished. He loved those things specifically. They were among the things he loved most, and he made room for them not reluctantly, but with the active generosity of a man who understood that loving someone fully meant loving everything they were. He told her once in the quiet of an evening in their 4th year of marriage, while the fire burned and Patrick was asleep upstairs and the prairie wind moved outside with its eternal conversation, that he had spent 4 years after Margaret died being afraid of this, of being this present in his own life, of having this much that could be lost. "I am still afraid sometimes," he said, "of losing you, of losing Patrick, of any of it going wrong." "I know," she said. "I am too." "But I would rather have the fear," he said, "than not have what makes it worth having." She took his hand. "That is exactly right," she said. "My father used to say that the land was honest because it gave you what it had and didn't pretend otherwise. You are like that." He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which had never lost its quality of warmth since the day he had kissed her under the Kansas stars in the spring of 1882. "That," he said, "is the best thing anyone has ever said to me." In the spring of 1885, their daughter was born, Ruth Margaret Easton, named for the 2 mothers who were present in spirit in the walls of Clearwater Ranch. The grandmother Eva had never met, and the first love of a man who had been brave enough to love again. She came into the world with her mother's dark eyes and her mother's expression of calm, forthright assessment, and by the time she was 2, she was following her older brother Patrick around the ranch with the focused determination of someone who has decided that wherever her brother is going, she is going too, and possibly faster. Patrick, who was his father's son in his patience and his mother's son in his stubbornness, accepted this with a resigned affection that made everyone who watched it want to smile. Silas watched his children with the same full attention he gave to everything that mattered, and Eva watched him watching them, and felt the particular happiness of a woman who has what she fought for, and knows what it cost and knows it was worth every cent of the cost. The 5th year, Eva rode down to the Donnelly land in Comanche County by herself on an afternoon in late September when the light was the particular gold of autumn, and the grass was turning, and the sky, was the deep, clear blue that only happened at that latitude in that season. She rode Consequence, who was getting older but still moved with her own particular authority, and she rode to the fence post where she had stood when she was 23 years old and been told she was trespassing on land that had been her father's, and she stood there again. The berries had done good work. The house had been painted. The barn had been repaired. The land looked cared for, tended, like something that had been given back to the purpose it had always been meant for. She stood at the fence post for a long time and thought about Patrick Donnelly, who had worked this land for 19 years and taught his daughter to read the weather and the contracts in the faces of liars, and who had died without knowing that she would get it back, but who had, by the way he had raised her, made absolutely certain that she would try. "I got it back," she said, the way she had said hello on the day she had first returned with Sela's and the deed. "I got it back, and I married a good man, and we have 2 children, and the ranch is good, and the world is not fair, but it is better when people insist on it being better, and I am still insisting." The wind moved through the grass. The light fell long and gold. She rode home to Clearwater Ranch in the afternoon, 4 miles east of Caldwell, and rode into the yard to find Sela's at the fence talking to one of the neighboring ranchers with Patrick perched on the top fence rail beside him, listening with the careful attention of a boy who has decided that everything his father knows is worth learning, and Ruth in the yard with the kitchen dog, a brown mutt that had arrived 2 years ago, and announced its intention to stay by the simple method of refusing to leave. And Eddie coming out of the barn with a bucket, and the whole scene warm and alive with the specific quality of a life that has been built honestly. Sela's looked up when she rode in, and his face did the thing it had always done since she had known him. It opened. Not all at once, not theatrically, but with the steady warmth of a man who is genuinely glad to see the person who is arriving. She dismounted and walked over to him, and he reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a small casual gesture that was entirely natural between them by now and never failed to feel like the most certain thing in the world. "Good ride?" he asked. "Good ride," she said. Patrick looked down from the fence rail at his mother with his father's dark eyes and said, with the seriousness of a 7-year-old who has been paying attention, "Was it your papa's land again?" "Yes," she said, "your grandfather's land." "Are we going to build something on it someday?" he asked, because she had told him the plan. "We are," she said, "when the time is right." Patrick nodded with the deliberateness of his father and turned back to the conversation with the neighboring rancher. And Eva looked at Sela's over their son's head, and he looked back at her. And the look contained everything that the years had built between them. The rain and the kitchen and the courthouse, and the stars, and the morning they had sat with cold coffee, and he had held her hand before the hardest day, and the night under the stars when she had said yes, and the morning Patrick was born, and the evening with the fire and the honest fear, and all of it, every day of it, woven into the fabric of a life that had become something neither of them had seen coming, but both of them had deserved. "Come inside," he said. "Supper is nearly ready. I took over the kitchen when Ruth decided the dog needed a bath." She looked at the dog, which was sitting in the yard looking damp and resigned. "Did she accomplish it?" "The dog is definitely cleaner," he said, with the careful neutrality of someone who has decided not to take a position on the relative merits of the outcome. She laughed and took his hand, and they walked inside together. The kitchen of Clearwater Ranch was warm and lit and smelling of what was on the stove, and Patrick came in behind them, and Ruth came in after him carrying the damp dog, which she set down by the stove with the confidence of a child who has never once considered that there might be a rule against this. And Eddie knocked and came in for supper the way he had been doing for 3 years, since Tom had married a woman from Caldwell and taken a small place of his own. And the table was full, and the lamp was lit, and outside the prairie moved with its ancient constant wind. Eva stood at the head of the kitchen that had once been just a room where adequate food was made for people who were all keeping at a careful distance from everything that might matter, and she looked at what it had become, loud and warm and imperfect, and entirely, completely, wonderfully alive. Silas came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and said, quietly, just for her, "What are you thinking?" She covered one of his hands with her own and leaned back against him just slightly, just enough. "I am thinking," she said, "that the territory owed me considerably more than it gave me." He was quiet. "But what it gave me," she said, "was better." She felt him press his lips to her hair, brief and sure, and then he said, "Let us eat before everything goes cold." And she laughed and they sat down at the table together, all of them in the light and the warmth. And outside the Kansas evening came in slow and vast and full of stars, and Clearwater Ranch held its people against the dark, and the wind the way a place does when it has been properly loved. And the story of what the territory had owed Eva Donnelly closed like a good book closes. Not empty, but full, every page of it accounted for. The ending arrived at honestly and held with both hands, certain and sure and entirely right.